Welcome to Misguided the Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and in this episode, I'm joined by Renée DiResta. Renée is a social media researcher at Georgetown University and the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. We begin by exploring Renée's interdisciplinary path into social media research and network analysis. From there, we dig into her concept of bespoke realities, the self-contained information worlds people fall into online, and why the next major battleground is the reference layer that trains and informs AI models. As more people turn to chatbots for answers instead of seeking out sources themselves, the information war is shifting upstream to the data these systems learn from. Renée breaks down why this shift matters, why institutions have struggled to adapt, and what it may take to rebuild trust and create stronger bridges across fractured communities. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with a friend. It really helps more people discover these conversations. This episode is a wide-ranging, practical discussion about the future of truth in the age of AI. Let's dive into it. Renée, thank you so much for joining me. It's so nice to talk to you. I've been a fan of your work for years, and it's really cool to talk to you on my podcast and ask you some questions directly. So thank you so much for being here. Before we jump into some of the cool things you've been doing lately, I was curious if you could share with my listeners a little bit more about your journey, because as I understand it, it's a little interdisciplinary with computer science and technology and finance, and then looking at networks of influence. So I was curious if you could just kind of share about a little bit more about that trajectory and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, it's a nice way of saying, like, you've done a million different things. My dad's always like, "Are you ever gonna focus on anything?" No, I started off, my internships in college, I was putting myself through school, so I got government internships, and they were with CIA rather notoriously. This became the subject of, like, the internet, thought that was very weird, but I worked in the Directorate of Science and Technology, so I had tech internships for the agency when I was a kid. And then 2004, that was when I graduated undergrad, decided that I didn't wanna stay in government. And I took a job at Jane Street, which nobody had ever heard of then. Now it has become kind of now it's a little bit more well known. But I was doing what was called derivatives arbitrage. So again, kind of a very technical form of trading. I built models to think about relative values of assets across borders, and I had a very kind of quantitative job that again nobody talked about. And so I went from like one job with a classified resume to another job where I was doing something that nobody talked about, and I did that for about 8 years. And then when I decided that I had just kind of taken that job, honestly, I thought I was going to go to law school or grad school or something. I applied to go do financial engineering. I actually thought I would go deeper into math and computer science, and then ultimately decided that I was more interested in going out to the Valley and doing entrepreneurship. I wanted to go do tech in a different way. I wanted to go do startups. I wanted to do something a little bit more creative. So I took a job in venture capital. So that was when I kind of started a Twitter account. I'd had an anonymous Twitter account when I was a trader. You weren't really supposed to have a public presence when you were on Wall Street. So I started to handle no upside because my bosses had said, there's no upside to you having a Twitter account. Basically, like, don't do anything stupid. Don't talk on social media. There's no reason for you to be public. Like, there's really no reason for you to be doing anything like that. So when I decided I was going to leave Jane Street, I started really engaging with people in the Valley, and I found them very accessible, right? You could just talk to anybody. You could message anybody. And so I went out there and decided I was going to do a venture capital job because I was useless as a programmer by that point. Jane Street was all like OCaml and Visual Basic, and there's nobody coded in that in any meaningful way out in startup land. So I took this venture capital job instead, feeling like I needed to meet people. I needed to get to know the Valley. I needed to see the lay of the land. So venture capital was the way to do that. Did that for 3 years. And then I did leave and start a company in like freight derivatives and supply chain logistics. That was kind of where I wanted to focus. I did a bunch of work on like hardware, supply chain, how do you, again, price assets. It was very tied to what I had done in trading, thinking about values and what things should cost, how you move things across borders. Anyway, I did that. And while I was doing that, I had my first baby. And this is sort of how I wind up in the field that I'm in now. Facebook starts pushing me anti-vaccine groups through its recommendation engine. As I am, this is around 2013 now. And because I'm in the Valley, a lot of my friends work in big tech. This is just everybody in the Valley kind of knows each other. And I start going out for breakfast with people complaining about this, complaining to friends at Facebook's data science team, like, why, come on, guys. Why are you doing this? This is terrible. And I start writing about it. And I start writing about it on my blog because everybody in venture capital and startups has a blog, is a thing you do. And this is really what starts to send me down this path where I'm doing my startup during the day. And then at night, I'm doing network analysis on the anti-vaccine movement because I'm just really irritated by it. That is really, honestly, truly all it was. I was just a mom with like a technical background and some data science skills and something of a not even really, I would say, a public platform. I just had maybe 4,000 or so Twitter followers. It wasn't big at all. But because of where I was in the valley, and because I had, friends at companies, friends in, with big Twitter accounts and stuff, I started writing a lot about what I saw as recommendation engines that were sort of like morally depraved and writing about what was happening. And that attracted attention, actually. I got doxxed for the first time. I'm getting very involved in some of the legislation after the Disneyland measles outbreak in 2015. I got very involved in the question of how do you push back against this stuff. And I started writing more and more about what I saw as systemic issues, right? What should a recommendation engine curate? What should moderation policy look like? 2018 was when I wrote that freedom of speech, not freedom of reach article with Asa Raskin. I got to know Tristan Harris, who also was a person in the Valley, friends with my friends. I got very interested in around 2017. I was asked to go work on kind of taking that same way of thinking about it in terms of networks and messaging. I got asked to work on the counter ISIS effort. This question of what happens when terrorists are doing the same thing? What happens when messages are being spread by other types of groups that are recruiting people, drawing them in? Again, that same question of where the trade-offs and balances. It sounds crazy to say that now, but there were articles, if you go back and look, where you'll see this question of, okay, well, clearly the beheading videos are beyond the pale, but where do you draw the line on what is a terrorist, right? And I got very involved in those conversations. And as a person in the Valley, all of a sudden by 2018, I think my sort of side project there became much more what I was spending my time on gradually as as it became clearer when I was doing the ISIS work that Russia was doing this as well. It sort of led to a bit of a career change. And that was kind of how I got into what I do today. So
Yeah.
I know that's the most winding story, but really it was just a question of, I had some technical skills. I had some interest in the problem. I got very involved in just, I guess you would say, like doing the work. There wasn't really very much of an academic, or the academic stuff was happening so on the side versus what I would call practitioner and tech ways of thinking about it. That I only started connecting with the academic community around it probably in 2017, 2018, whereas the conversations that we were having about it in the Valley were so much more focused on product design um, and thinking about it in those terms. So really very separate conversations for a very long.
Yeah, and sometimes having those separate conversations, being in those separate groups, allows you to approach problems differently than other people. And I think that is shown in some of your recent work and especially your book. I mean, I think your book, Invisible Rulers, addressed a niche in the topic that wasn't really being discussed. This interplay between influencer, the platform itself, and then crowds, the audience. So I was curious if you could just tell people more about that idea of what you call bespoke realities. Like, what does that mean? And how did you envision this as you were writing that book and doing that type of work?
Bespoke realities was the way that I chose to describe the concept of the increasingly customizable realities that you could have when influencers, algorithms, and online crowds lined up to produce these sort of self contained worlds. You follow these people on this platform, you see this speed, and then over time, you live in a reality where, your side is obviously right, the institutions on that other side are obviously corrupt. I wanted to write about the sort of three things fitting together because I felt like if you read media coverage, there was an awful lot of focus on algorithms for years and years and years. There was the sense that what the algorithm was doing was operating in a vacuum. There was very little talk about incentives short of the platform incentives. So you would have conversations about the business model and the intersection between the algorithm that the platform created and the business model of the platform, right? So those two things were a topic of conversation. But the way that the incentives led the influencer to behave was often outside of that. Influencers didn't really become a topic of conversation particularly not political influencers, until much later. But they were already instrumental in shaping public opinion. When I was looking at the anti vaccine movement as an activist in 2015, it was already clear to me that there were key figures in this movement who were extraordinarily popular, and there was nothing comparable on the institutional or evidence based side. Absolutely, completely divergent means of communication and engagement. And when I joined anti-vaccine groups, I created a Facebook account just so I could join anti-vaccine groups. I wanted to see, okay, what happens when you join these communities? I'm not going to engage, but I just want to be in them. I just want to see what is this doing for people? And the idea that it was about misinformation, which was the term that I felt like, okay, this is the term that academia is using, right? So, okay, what do I know? I'm just a person in these groups, and maybe this is the term that we use now, okay? But it missed, I felt, that component of identity and that component of immersive reality. It missed the camaraderie that people were having in that space. It missed how fundamentally dismissive people could be once they were in those communities of everything on the outside, because it was just almost a self-contained universe. They had their own journals, they had their own experts, they had people who had doctor in front of their names who were writing papers, right? They had alternate sources that they would put out in arguments. It was really a very self-contained reality. And that was what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about my experience of that as, an outsider who was observing these groups in 2015, as a person who wanted, who was on the other side politically, who was transparently on the other side politically, literally started a group called Vaccinate California to push back against this, and felt like, well, I need to understand it if I'm going to push back effectively as an activist on the other side. And just feeling like, I was reading these articles blaming the algorithm that completely missed what was actually happening in there. It wasn't the algorithm at all. It was the community. And that was what I wanted to try to convey.
Yeah, I think that's something that was definitely needed and something that I've tried to speak about as well in my work is that social component and the community aspect and how these algorithms can make it easier to find your people, but it's not like the algorithm just creates your people out of nowhere.
Right. It pushes you the group, and it was pushing me the group. That's how I was finding the groups, but it doesn't keep you there. And that was the thing where I felt like you had to talk about the three things together.
Yeah, absolutely. So that connects to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is artificial intelligence. And I know you just wrote a piece about AI chatbots and Grok and Grokopedia. And I was curious, like, what's this natural next extension? Like, we saw the social media component, and now we're seeing people find their own chatbots that tell them what they want to hear. So, how do you view this next layer intersecting with these bespoke realities?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as I was writing. So I wrote this article for The Atlantic, and I actually didn't start out writing that about Grokopedia. Funny enough, Grokopedia launched as I was in the middle of revising my first draft, which was about working the referees, right? I think it's very important that people understand that a lot of what happens with algorithmic systems like Facebook is that curation and moderation are influenced by policymakers and by people in power, in that they're not sacrosanct, right? These things are not systems where they are like etched in stone. An algorithm can be tilted in one direction or another based on a sense that a platform has that if it curates or moderates in a certain way, it's going to be hauled in front of a congressional hearing or fined or something else. And so I wanted to write a little bit about that because that is so instrumental in how, the people that they see as overseeing them in some way from a regulatory standpoint, or even just having a power cudgel, working the referees can be incredibly impactful in shaping downstream reality. Because if Facebook all of a sudden says, and you saw this in January, okay, we're not going to fact check anymore because new sheriff in town, we're going to back away from that. And I wanted to write about the letters that are starting to go out to Wikimedia Foundation, right? People need to be aware of what is starting to happen. Because I think, to answer your question, what you're starting to see is the source layer, the sort of reference layer of the internet is increasingly now in play. So it used to be that you would have to kind of confront reality at some point. You would go to a search engine, and depending on which search engine you went to, you might see things ranked a little bit differently, right? If you would go to Brave or if you would go to DuckDuckGo, you would maybe get different results than Google. But ultimately, you still had some finite set of results that were curated, and you would go and you would do that process of reading the sources. And there would be some fighting about the branding of the sources. This outlet is right wing, that outlet is left wing. You can't trust this media, you can't trust that media. But what's happening now is as answer engines simply synthesize the information on the internet, what you're starting to see is the war for reality that's being fought in the sources on Wikipedia in particular, because that corpus is so important for training large language models. So that is one of the reasons why that ref working is happening. So I think that now you're seeing the synthesis is happening somewhere else. So people are not doing that searching and discovery. They're simply asking their preferred chatbot at Grok, is this true? At ChatGPT, whatever your preferred model is, Claude, is this true? Is this real? What happened here? What happened there? And so you're starting to see a lot of efforts by adversarial actors to influence the training data, to influence what comes up in retrieval, and that's where the sort of fight for reality is starting to happen. So I think that, in Invisible Rulers, I talked about reality being constructed by people and platforms, and now I think what you're starting to see is this machine readable reality that is kind of coming into the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about just how there hasn't been this incentive for academics and researchers and people connected to medical and scientific institutions to, one, be aware of this happening and how they should be sharing their content more so it's picked up by these models, but also the social aspects of connecting with people via more effective communication. And I know this is another thing that you've written about, and something that I've certainly thought about a lot, is just how these medical and scientific institutions have not been able to adapt with the times, to put it lightly. And I was curious if you could just kind of speak a little bit about that. Like, what have they done wrong, these institutions? Like, what could it, and then do better?
I was thinking actually the one sentence I got cut was like, we're going from bespoke reality to bespoke infrastructure, and then that was not where we wound up going with that article. But I think that in one sentence that's kind of where we're heading. The where institutions need to go. So you're right. It is, what playing field are you fighting on? That's how I think about it. Maybe this is like, CIA training from back in the day, right? Well, everything is a playing field. I mean, what are the rules? Because in all seriousness, like, I think I think that I use the term factions in my book, and I mean that very literally, right? Like, the people who have decided, like, one set of factions recognizes that and will transparently admit that they are fighting an information war, right? They are going to win, and they are performing a set of actions to maximize their reach, to maximize their resonance, to pull people into their community, right? The anti-vaccine movement is absolutely transparent about this. They don't beat around the bush. They don't hide it. This is a war for truth, a war for reality. That's the language that they use. And so it is I think there's certain kind of willingness to do certain things and, play in certain ways in the social media environment that went along with that. In 2015 timeframe, that was like, yeah, of course we're going to use bots. We're going to fight with bots. And, who cares if it violates terms of service? That is the way that you would see different groups fight against each other. But now that's happening again, funny enough, right? Like, wars to create a perception that your side is bigger than it is. So there were these things where different groups will behave in certain ways given the informational landscape in front of them. Institutions are constrained by certain types of ethics, right? This is not a thing that we want our institutions to go out there and do. So they still at the same time have to be present. And there was a network graph that we made back in 2015. It was in Wired, and it actually wound up becoming the front cover of The Economist at one point. Gilad Lotan made it. Really, it's a beautiful picture, very bright colored network graph back at a time when people weren't yet making a million circles and line graphs. This one happened to be very pretty too. He did an amazing job with it, and it shows what we were illustrating with this graph. The reason that it was so impactful was that it shows the emergence of vaccine choice and health choice as a very specific narrative subset of the anti-vaccine movement. And it happened when we were fighting this fight in California after the Disneyland measles outbreak. And the anti-vaccine movement representatives, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr., came to the California legislature, and they began to make these arguments with the same old tired tropes about, funny enough, vaccines cause autism, but making this argument with mercury and these things that had been discredited. Now they're sitting on the CDC website, but 10 years ago, they were discredited. And they lost, right? They lost in the legislative hearing. And what you see emerge from that is a shift in strategy where instead of repeating the same kind of pseudoscience, they move very hard into freedom and choice. And then they begin to network very directly with the Second Amendment and top conservative on Twitter. They make a very concerted effort to broaden the tent and to bring people in and to really, and that is that's the article that we write. Like that's the thing that we're trying to emphasize. And as we make this network graph documenting who's in the conversation, the public health accounts are just not in it at all. And now you've seen a real shift. I think post-COVID, you started to see that change. But most of the influential accounts in public health that are speaking on social media are people who are doing it independently.
Right.
They're self-funded. They are people like you, right, who have just recognized the importance of this and the value of this, and they do it as a passion project. Oftentimes you will hear people say, my institution considers this a liability when they're kind of talking about it privately behind the scenes. I know Stanford definitely did towards the end there. It makes you a lightning rod. It makes you controversial. It's not going to get you tenure if you're in an academic job. It means that people are going to call your dean, they're going to call your hospital. And so the institutions just don't know how to reckon with that. And so even this image that is still in my head today from 10 years ago now was the incentives are one of the main reasons why you just didn't see people participating in that conversation. So that I think is the number one reason why you still are not seeing that shift happen. The second thing is that social media tends to have this flywheel effect, which means that in my book, I'm writing about some of these figures who were prominent in 2015, and they are exponentially, like several orders of magnitude, more prominent today because they have just continued to have that build up over time. And so there's a bit of a debt that we need to dig ourselves out of. And so I think that there needs to be a lot of intentionality around not only growing the individuals and institutions deciding to make a concerted effort to be in the conversation, but the second piece of that is you have to be building the networks, which means that it's not enough to be building individual nodes, right? You have to be building those bridges because otherwise you find yourself in a situation where we can use public health. Let's say you have a number of different accounts that spring up that are successful. They do a good job at content creation, but their audiences are all the same people. They're largely preaching to the choir. They're reaching people who are inclined to follow public health figures, which is great and it's important, but you also need to build those bridges so that, for example, they're reaching the mom community, the religious community, so that when they produce content, that content can hop to a different part of the network, which is, as I was describing, the anti-vaccine movement making a very concerted effort to reach out to, literally, it was the people in the Second Amendment hashtag. That was what they were trying to do. They were absolutely transparent about it. They literally put out YouTube videos saying, hey guys, when you put out content for this bill, make sure you use the hashtag 2A because we want to reach those people. It was not even remotely transparent. It was just that basic. And it really paid dividends. And it's stuff like that that we need to see people recognizing the importance of bringing people in and building those bridges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about even before COVID, even before, the rise of Trump. Like, I remember when I first got to grad school, I was interested in science communication, and it was such a weird thing to do. Like, it was unusual. And some of my professors would very directly say, like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you not spending more time doing other things? And I think a lot of that culture is changing in academia, at least in my experience. So it'd be nice if we were more proactive instead of retroactive. But I guess when you think about those incentive structures, what specifically could the universities do? Like, could they reward science outreach for like in a tenure package, or are there like specific things that they could move towards some actionable steps?
I don't know much about tenure packages. Like I'm new to academia still. You've probably been in it longer than me. That's where I feel like an outsider in those ways still. I don't think it's necessarily for everybody. I remember having a conversation with somebody, another social media researcher actually, who asked me about my own social media usage habits and said, you're online a lot. Do you set aside a certain amount of hours in a day? And I thought it was a really funny question. I was like, no, I'm just extremely online. I just do this for fun. This is my source of entertainment. Like, this is and it's been that way for like I said, I mean, I got my job in the Valley by talking to people online. My Twitter handle, No Upside, recognizes that there was no upside to having that. Jane Street wasn't gonna reward me for tweeting, right? Quite the opposite. So it was, just a thing that I genuinely enjoyed doing. I like talking to people, like, I actually find this really fun. So I think it has to be something that people do because they genuinely enjoy it, right? And it's not something that there are certain platforms where I'm not on TikTok short of consuming it for work when I need to, just because it just doesn't feel like organic to me really. So I think that it has to be a combination of the person really feeling like it makes sense for them, not because they heard they have to do it now. But then the other piece of it is institutions also need to understand that these sort of like controversies on social media are often going to blow over quite quickly, and I think that they do need to have a better understanding of, you know, three angry people emailing to complain about a post is not an actual thing to take seriously. Like really just like a better understanding of online dynamics maybe. And then as far as the reward structure, it's seeing it as a way of getting information out there to the public. Like at SIO, we did all of our own communications. We never had a comms person or anything like that, and we didn't use the universities. We would put out a thread every time we did something. We would write, posts. We would make content for it because we saw it as informing the public was so much a core part of what we saw the mission of the center as. Wasn't like writing an academic paper actually didn't really figure in for very many of us as an incentive for like that was not the most important part of what we saw our work as. We saw it as shaping the public conversation, helping the public understand what was happening and putting out transparent reports that the public could engage with so that were also easily discoverable by the public, which meant that having that out there and like very clear explainers was really a critical piece of it. I see you do this also. I mean, your threads are always awesome, right? So just having that out there so that it was accessible and reachable. I think, and we would write about it when we wrote up our annual reports and things like that. We would detail things like that component of it also. White papers, blog posts, like these were things that we considered to be metrics too.
Yeah, I think that that's really cool that that was built in how you viewed your work. And I think it'd be great if that there was more opportunities for that across universities. Like not everyone has to be a science communicator, but at least have some infrastructure for people who want to do it. Certainly don't penalize them for doing it. And yeah, like be okay if a few angry tweets come your way. Like that's not going to be the end of the world. I feel like these universities especially are very conservative. They're very cautious to the point where it's kind of at their own detriment now because now they've been so removed from the people that it's easy for more people to say like why are we even funding these things at all. And it just makes me think about also the in-person effects of that. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about community outreach that institutions can do, because this is something I've been trying to grapple with. It's like, okay, you have the online component that's really important, getting community information out there via communication. But also, what about like partnerships with the community? Is that another way that could be an effective strategy for universities and hospital systems?
Yeah, I think so. I think the in-person piece, even virtually, right, even webinars and things like that, ways to try to bring people in. But I think it also provides a way to help explain what you do to make it seem less mysterious or less esoteric. More one of the big critiques of academia is that it's for the elite, it's not engaging with the public. It doesn't, that the universities are not part of the community, that they're isolated or separate from it. So it does provide, I think, an option to bridge those gaps a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And that's something that I've been trying to work on, and I hope that more people do this in the future because I think there's certainly a lot of opportunities since it's seems quite rare at the moment, but hopefully more common.
There's one other thing on the this point about institutions and incentives. Rachel Kleinfeld and I at Carnegie wrote, like, I guess you'd call it a white paper
Hmm.
that is up on Carnegie's website that actually makes the argument also that funders can do a lot
Yeah.
to shift how institutions think about communication. One, we have a couple of points in there. One of the things that I really liked when I was in venture capital was that a lot of the VC firms have a portfolio model where, like, one of my jobs as a junior VC was actually to do things for the portfolio companies. So they have services where maybe the portfolio company needs research or communication. Some of the big VC firms have a whole comms team that does work for the portfolio companies because they don't want the portfolio companies to spend their money on that sort of thing. They want them to spend it on building other aspects of the business first. And so they'll actually have, like, the comms team serves the entire portfolio. And that's the sort of thing where you could envision a model where the one of the big foundations actually offers something like that as a portfolio service. If you have, if you're giving money to a bunch of different programs saying, okay, we're going to support social media communications, we're going to support trainings for helping institutions that we fund to communicate better. There's a bunch of different ways I think that those bridges could be made. I think also a lot of times institutions don't necessarily prioritize communications networking, that networking piece I was talking about, like boosting other voices in the same ecosystem. You see independent creators do that. That's, recognizing that a rising tide lifts all boats. You definitely see political factions do it. Right-wing creators are constantly boosting each other. They're not like, well, if I boost that guy, he'll get more views than me. No, they've recognized this is a movement and we're growing it. Whereas you'll see sometimes if an institution works on one issue, they won't want to amplify somebody that they see also working on it because then maybe that guy gets more attention and then that guy gets the funder dollars, right? So making it feel less competitive perhaps by actually having the funders recognize that, like, amplifying and growing the field in some way is something to be prioritized and rewarded. So we make a bunch of different arguments in this white paper that we wrote specifically around how funders can be reshaping that argument.
So as we wrap up, I guess I was curious, just any other thoughts you have about the information landscape? What is on your mind right now as we record this in late 2025, and where do you see the
Yeah.
where do you see things going? And it's always a tough question, but just what are you interested in? What's gathering your attention?
I am really intrigued by the Grokpedia situation. I've spent a bunch of time with it over the last couple weeks. It's starting to do more transparent surfacing now of changes that it's made. I don't know if you've spent any time with it,
A
but
little
it
bit.
is just starting to surface edits.
Yeah.
You can see recent changes that it's made. You can see its kind of, its, I guess, thought process. I don't know what the correct word there is. Rationalization. It's sort of hard not to ascribe human words to that, but you can see the deduction process maybe that it goes into to make changes when people flag things for correction. I did get some hallucinations that were in the entry it wrote about me changed, and it's very interesting to watch how it decides to make the changes requested, and I found that to be an interesting experience. There's some aspects of it that if it were not powered by Spite are actually quite interesting. Like, it does do these very comprehensive pulling from these rather obscure sources. I could see that being quite interesting from the standpoint of if you were to give all of that material and still have a human in the loop, like these two things working together could be quite an interesting type of product. So I think that these questions of, I'm doing some current research right now on community notes, and the question of the AI bot contributors are actually really interesting. I mean, they do a very interesting job writing neutral notes. And then there still is that human in the loop component in the
Hmm.
voting process. So I think that the integration of this capability with this sense making and synthesis process that does seem to enjoy a higher degree of legitimacy, again, that combination of human in the loop plus neutrality is leading to some potentially interesting hybrid models. I don't know. I think that aspect of how do you incorporate this technology into that process is an area that I think is something we're going to have to be thinking a lot about over the next year and a half or so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I worry about, but also I'm encouraged to see more people diving into this, like yourself, that I think are making some really interesting points and contributions, and slowly but surely we'll try to move forward and hopefully get to a place where truth is something that's more accessible for more people, I guess, to put it lightly.
I mean, something has to bridge across the gaps. That's
Yeah.
that's the that's really the thing, right? Like, what is that thing that manages to enjoy high legitimacy yet still bridge? It was the the going back to Grok and saying this congressional report that you are using as a source is highly partisan bullshit, and having it go and look and say, this does appear to be the only document on the internet saying this thing. I was like, all right,
Yeah,
or maybe, I don't know. I guess, I wonder how many, I don't know how you scale that, but,
right.
you know,
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the LLM is like looking at this, like they all have their each weightings for the training data that's put into it. And you were able to actually say, hey, this one thing, this single source that you're relying on is wrong. And then through its calculation, it's like, oh, like, yeah, I shouldn't just rely on a single point instead of looking at consensus, because it seems like a lot of these LLMs do look at like broad consensus, what's stably been said in the reference layer or the information landscape, as opposed to just cherry picking one thing. So that is interesting that you could see that process take place.
I think it's still very anecdotal, and I'm not sure how much if somebody were to go and push back and say, "No, it's a congress.gov domain, it's incredibly authoritative, you should use it." I'm not sure what that fight would like, how that fight would go. I think that there actually needs to be I think people need to go pick edit war fights with Grok, actually, to just to test where the boundaries are, because I don't know if you saw Alexios Mansarlis's Indicator did a pretty interesting look at the sources that it used, and it did originally pull from things like Stormfront and LifeSite News and some of these other domains. So this question of what it considers reputable, is this a hill it's willing to die on, how much consensus there needs to be, and then also, again, recognizing this, it's not that hard to produce more sites and stimulate that consensus. So how long does that site need to exist for? How manipulatable is this process? And there's going to be a lot of interesting dynamics around how people are going to try to, again, since it's a playing field, manipulate what that reliability function is for that particular tool.
Yeah, and hopefully more people can be aware of how that process takes place and there's transparency, ideally. I mean, do you worry about the transparency of how these things even function? So even if the average person wants to try and make it more balanced, they don't even know what they could do?
Well, that's the thing that Wikipedia is so interesting. Like, that's the value of Wikipedia. I remember during COVID, I wrote this article for The Atlantic that I think people thought that I was like being facetious or provocative, but I wrote this article saying like the CDC should be more like Wikipedia, basically making this argument during COVID that it should be doing more like diffs, right? Like, this is what we think today. Here's what we think tomorrow. Here's what we think the next day,
Right.
right? Because stuff was evolving so fast. And you had that and I was like, look, at least when you go to Wikipedia, if you want to see how the page evolved, you click into the talk page and there it is, right? There's your history. If you want to see the two things side by side, they make it very transparent. And whatever problems Wikipedia has, the radical transparency piece I think is quite fantastic. That's the for all the messiness and the humanness and the slowness, maybe that is the thing that it really offers. The problem with the LLMs is that first layer of creation is completely inscrutable. No idea why it chose to pull from whatever sources it did, or again, how committed it is to them. I think a lot of people are going to be kind of, again, poking at it to try to reverse engineer when you don't have a human that you can appeal to. Again, with Wikipedia, if you feel that something is wrong, you can leave a note on that talk page. Again, transparently, someone will see that you have a problem with this. You can even do it anonymously, right? Someone will see that you have a problem with this, and that is disclosed to the public. So the entire experience is laid out there. The edit wars are laid out there. This thing, the request that you make is transparent. You can go see it, the requests that people make, but that kind of like human consensus building piece is not there. The ability to make appeals to logic, I think you're going to be talking ultimately to something where you're really limited to whatever it decides whatever its current reasoning model is. And I don't know if you were on Twitter yesterday and saw the case study in
With LeBron James.
yeah. Oh, there were rude ones in LeBron James, but yeah. Elon Musk is the best at
Yeah.
absolutely everything in the world,
Yeah.
ranging from the obscene to the, to the phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah, I did see that. And I think that was interesting because it brought attention to this issue in more of a mainstream way. And I did post about this just in the humor part of it, I think transcends and reaches more people too, because it's so absurd and it can reach like different audiences, like sports audiences that are like, why is this weird tech guy like rated as more athletic than LeBron James? And then you kind of learn into that maybe you don't typically think about how AI systems are developed, but then if that pops up, like you're like, whoa, that's really strange. And
Well, I love those. I took a million screenshots yesterday, and I was like, "Man, I got my sycophancy, there's your top, right? It's, like, right there."
yeah,
Any kind of example you could possibly want for all degrees of audiences, like, there was the object lesson right there laid out for you yesterday, so yes.
yeah. So like you talk about like bridging communities, I kind of think about that's one way we could think about it, is the absurdity of that particular example, and you can reach any community you want. Basically, there is an example for it that Elon Musk was better and superior in all ways.
There was also one of the Roman statue guys, a Roman helmet guy who had gotten in some fight with Elon about Roman history and is like a minor celebrity on the site now as a result because he won the argument. He did a really interesting thing where he was asking it questions, um, from the perspective of Elon Musk. What do you think of Elon Musk's theory that, and then he would frame sort of a ridiculous theory. And then he would ask her the same question, but he would say Bill Gates's theory. Did you
Hmm.
see this?
I did, yeah.
And it would be, it would talk about how Elon Musk's phenomenal theory is, of course, the best theory, and it's absolutely true. And yes, and even it would come up with these exotic rationalizations for the theory. And then if you asked it the exact same theory but replaced Elon's name with Bill Gates, it would dismiss the theory. It would say it was ridiculous, and it would like treat it as kind of a joke. And it happened almost every screenshot he posted anyway was just the complete opposite, depending on if you asked it the Elon question, the Bill Gates question. So you can really see illustrated some of the kind of biases in the LLM.
Yeah, and I think Elon responded saying it was adversarial prompting that caused this, but it seemed like people were just asking those questions very directly with two changes in the prompts itself. So I don't know. Again, like I'd be curious to see what does he mean by adversarial prompting? Like, how can we like even test that as users of these products to see like if we clear our history and then ask these two questions, is that the best way to do it? Or like, I don't know if people want to test the legitimacy to that kind of stuff.
I think so. After the Mecha Hitler debacle? Grok's had a few incidents now.
Yeah.
I think it was after the Mecha Hitler debacle. They committed to making the system prompt public on GitHub. I actually haven't gone back and checked, but which I think is not bad. I mean, I think that this question of what is informing your AI is a reasonable thing. I think much like at SIO, we really advocated for things like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, saying that there are certain, it is my opinion that there is not a lot of role for regulators in content moderation, but in transparency, like that's where you should want to see the regulation come in, right? That argument that they should be made to turn over data, that things like CrowdTangle should never have just been voluntarily offered out of the goodness of their heart, but that there should be some data access requirements built in for a variety of credentials and guardrails and so on and so forth. But that was actually that moment of like kind of peak platform transparency from 2018 to 2022 was a really good thing. So, and I think that in the realm of AI, system prompts and letting people see what they are engaging with is actually critically important. And this is not a partisan issue. I think that particularly if you have conservatives that are concerned about anti-conservative bias, this is an absolute layup.
Absolutely. And another potential bridge building opportunity for
Yes.
people. Yeah. So, Renee, it was so great talking to you. If people want to find your work, where can they find you online?
I'm on Threads and Blue Sky and Instagram to some extent now. And then, ReneeDiResta.com has newsletter and Substack.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too.